And I'm not only talking about what's going on in Israel on our borders with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. I'm also talking about what's going on in this country, what's going on worldwide, what's going on in the complex, sick, and twisted relationship between our government and the Chinese Communist Party. I don't want to get too political. I mean, I do, but I'm not going to. We have to understand what time it is. And that's what I'm here today to discuss for the next few minutes. Because how do we think about war? What is the Bible? Does the Bible tell us how to think about war? Is there a theology of war? And the answer is there is. And to understand war, the meaning of war, and specifically the meaning of this war, we'll turn to a psalm that it looks like was written for this war that Israel's fighting. Like it's been sitting for 3,000 years or so, waiting to be relevant, and it describes the war that we're in right now. And that's Psalm 83. Before we read through the psalm, before we look at it, I just want to tell you a little bit about this psalm and its importance currently. On October 7th, when Hamas attacked, there was a young man who was in one of the elite commando units in the Israeli army who was killed in one of those kibbutzes outside of Gaza that was hit hardest, Kfar Aza. And he was one of the initial response teams that went in there to fight the terrorists. His name is Yosef Malachi Gedalia. Yosef Malachi Gedalia's father, David, is one of my best friends. We grew up together. Yosef Malachi Gedalia's grandfather, David's father, and my father were college roommates. Our families have been connected for a long time. You know, you have these family friends that you're so close to, you almost feel like your cousins. It's one of those families. So Yosef Malachi was killed in Kfar Aza fighting the terrorists that day. A beautiful young man that I watched grow up. He had recently gotten married. He was a newlywed. And I went to his funeral at the military cemetery on Mount Herzl in the early days of the war, a few days after he was killed. And at the funeral, the Israeli army rabbi, the chaplain who was officiating, read Psalm 83. And I was like, that's interesting. And the reason I thought that is that if you've already opened Psalm 83 and you're bored by what I'm saying, so you're reading it already, you know that it's not a mournful psalm. It's not a psalm that you would associate with a funeral. This isn't Psalm 23. Okay, it has nothing to do with what you'd expect to read at a funeral. And so I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And I asked someone next to me, why is he reading Psalm 83? And I was told something that I did not know, which is that Psalm 83 is read at the funeral of every Israeli soldier who falls in combat. And that was a decision made decades ago that I was not aware of. So I went home and I took out my Bible and I read Psalm 83 very carefully. And if you've learned anything from me over the years, I say it all the time. You got to read the Bible carefully. Amen. Right? Because even people who read the Bible, so many of us don't read the Bible carefully, asking all those questions that you've heard me ask here. Why does it say that? Noticing all kinds of anomalies in the text, taking them seriously. So I read Psalm 83 and I was stunned. Because I said, oh my gosh, going back to what I said about Ecclesiastes, this psalm tells us how to think about war. And if it's a time for war, this is the psalm we have to read. And then sure enough, a few days later, something happened that has never happened in any of Israel's previous wars. Even though this psalm has been read at the funerals of every Israeli soldier who falls in combat for decades, the chief rabbis of Israel made a declaration that they'd never made in past wars. They called on all the synagogues in Israel to start praying Psalm 83 every day, in addition to our other daily prayers, to add in Psalm 83. It was a very interesting announcement, because as you'll see as we go through it, this psalm is not only about war, it's about this war. So let's take a look. Is it up here? We got the first verse up there? Okay. Oh, I see. I have it up here. Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace. Do not be still, O God. Let's keep going. For behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. Now that's interesting. Your enemies and those who hate you. Right? We have two different phrases here. Your enemies and those who hate you. What's the difference between your enemies and those who hate you? Isn't that a Rabbi Wolicki type of question? Right? What's the difference between that? Your enemies and those who hate you. Sounds like, is this just redundant? No such thing. So your enemies are the ones who actually attack. Those who hate you, they're not actually physically attacking, but they're just declaring their hatred for you. So I believe that this is describing this strange alliance that we have today in the world. And I alluded to it before. What on earth do atheist, Marxist leftists have in common with devout Muslim fundamentalists? Why are they working together? Why are they on the same team? Because it's an alliance of those who attack us and those who hate God. That's the alliance. Those who are your enemies and those who hate you. But now, let's step back for a second and ask a simple question. We're talking about, let's read another verse. It'll become clear. I'll ask this question then. Let's keep going. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted together against your sheltered ones. One more verse. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more. Now, I don't know if you picked this up, we referred to the enemies of God as the enemies of Israel, that the people who attack Israel are your enemies, God. Now that's a pretty arrogant thing for us to say as a member of the people of Israel, right? I mean, how arrogant is that? People who hate me, they're God's enemies. Why is that? Oh, you can say, we're God's chosen people, but let me explain. There is a phrase that appears in the Bible a lot, especially in the book of Ezekiel, incidentally. In the book of Ezekiel, it's a very common phrase, but it appears all over the Bible. And you've seen it before when you read the Bible, you kind of gloss over it, where God will say something and then say, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Or, and you shall know that I am the Lord, right? Over and over again. In other words, it's God's way of saying, this is how you know me. If you look up that phrase, take out a concordance and look up where that phrase appears in the Bible, and they shall know that I am the Lord. Where does God say that based on people will know that he's God? Almost every time. Not every time, but the vast majority of the times that phrase appears in the Bible, the context is the ingathering of the people of Israel to our land after a long exile. The redemption of Israel. That's almost always the context. Where God says, there's other ways to know God, but the most common is the ingathering of Israel. Now, why is that the way to see God? If I just came into church this morning and said, how do you know God? How do you see him in the world? We could have a whole conversation. We could have all kinds of different answers. But God tells us over and over again in the Bible that the best way to see him, to know that he is God, is to see the redemption of the people of Israel. Now, why? Why is that the best way to see God in the world? It's not just Jews being arrogant and saying, we're God's people. Let me explain. You see, The most repeated prophecy in the Bible, by far, is that same prophecy, that the people of Israel will go into exile for a long time and will ultimately be redeemed and brought back and rebuild themselves as a nation. That is the most repeated prophecy in the Bible. It's also the most outlandish prophecy in the Bible. The fact that it's happened, and we live in a time where the people of Israel have been ingathered by the millions, and the state of Israel was reborn 76 years ago, and here we are. So we think it's normal, and I've talked about this in this church before. It's not normal. Many, many nations in the ancient world went into exile. Tons of them. That's why you read about all these ancient peoples in books like the Bible. These ancient books, you see all these names of nations that don't exist anymore. Right? Where are all those people? They didn't all die out and get replaced by us. They lost their national identities. They went into exile, and nations that went into exile never, ever returned. Never. So empires would sweep across the world. They conquer smaller peoples. They chop off the heads of all the fighting age males, and they send everyone into exile. And they'd mix up the peoples. And they did that because it's much easier to do that than to rule over them in their homeland. So nations were constantly getting exiled in the ancient world, and none of them ever returned. They would dream about going home for a generation or two. They'd ultimately learn new languages and assimilate and mix, and new national identities were born. So when Moses predicted for the first time in Deuteronomy 30, but then all the other prophets repeated it, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, all of them, that the people of Israel, after a long exile, would come back and reconstitute themselves as a people in their land, it was an outlandish, ridiculous prophecy. It was like predicting water running uphill. So God says, if you watch that happen, you will know that I am God, because that is a crazy prophecy. That is a wild miracle. That violates all the rules of history. So pay attention to that and you'll know that I am God. See, the Jewish people's purpose is not the Jewish people. We are a pawn that God uses to reveal himself to the world. So those who try to prevent that prophecy from being fulfilled, those who stand against the reconstitution of the nation of Israel in our land, are standing against the entire narrative of the Bible. They're standing against God's purposes. So the enemies of Israel are God's enemies because they're trying to prevent that big event that reveals him to the world. And they shall know that I am the Lord, they're trying to stop that. That's why the enemies of Israel are the enemies of God.